All right, guys, our next unit is something called imaginary numbers. And it sounds funny that something like imaginary numbers exist, but it is true. There is such thing as real numbers, actual numbers that exist, and imaginary numbers, which are kind of like fake numbers. And the reason why they're fake, they come out of this. They're actual, it starts with defining what the square root of -1 is. Now, remember, when you square root a number, you're saying what number times itself. Like the square root of 9 is 3, right? Because 3 times 3 equals 9, right? So if you try and square root a negative, right? So you're trying to say what number times itself equals -9. Even if you make both of these negative, remember, a negative times a negative is positive. So there's no way to multiply a number by itself and have the answer be negative. So this technically is not real. It does not exist in the realm of real numbers. Okay. However, because mathematicians don't accept that, they created a whole other set of numbers called the imaginary numbers to answer this question. Okay. So if you were to type into your calculator, okay, the square root of -1, right? So that's like the smallest negative number you could square root, okay? You're gonna get non-real answer, right? You're gonna get an error. It's not a real answer, okay? So, however, if we change the mode of our calculator, you see if I scroll all the way down here to where it says real, that's what's highlighted right now. Next to it, do you see this A plus BI, it says? If you click on that mode, right, change your mode from real to that. Now go back to this and try and square root -1, and all of a sudden we have an answer. And it says the answer is I, okay? So, if you think about it, so like if we were to take away the negative, right? The square root of 1 is 1, right? But because we're trying to square root a negative, it's not regular 1, it's what we call imaginary 1. So it's actually 1i, okay? 1i is just the same thing as I, okay? So when you're square rooting numbers that are negative, you're basically going to square root them the same way you did when they were positive, but now add on an I, letting you know it's imaginary, okay? So here's what I mean. So I'm actually going to scoot, if we go into the packet, I'm actually going to go jump a few pages right here, all the way up to page 6, okay? So like if you look at this, so the first example on page 6 says the square root of -36. Well, again, let's start with just the square root of +36. So the square root of 36 would just be 6, right? So the square root of -36 is just 6 with an I on it, letting you know it's the imaginary 6. That's the answer, okay? So same thing here. The square root of -100, okay, is the same thing as the square root of 100, which is 10, with an I tacked on. Now, also, because these are perfect, if I had typed them into my calculator, right? Do you see it gives me the answer as well, 10i, okay? All right, so this one has a negative on the outside, so that anything on the outside is just gonna come down. Then we're gonna square root this, again, because it's the square root of 81 is 9, but because it's negative, it becomes 9i, okay? This one has a 2 on the outside. So again, anything on the outside comes down for now. And then we just worry about this part. Remember, the square root of 49 is 7, but with a negative on it, it's 7i. So I can clean this one up a little. Because it's multiplication, I am allowed to multiply these. This is 2 times 7i, and I get 14i. Okay? All right, so again, anything in front, we're just going to bring down, okay? And then we're gonna square root this, and we're gonna get square root of -64 is just, again, it's not -8, it's 8i. Okay, so as soon as you see a negative under the square root, that becomes the I, and then you just worry about simplifying the number that was next to the I. If you multiply 1/8 by 8, you just get 1. So you could write this as 1i, or you could just write this as I. Okay? And the rest of these are just like that. But for now, with the perfect squares, that's all you're gonna do. So again, notice if I had typed that into my calculator, right? So if I go, excuse me, if I go to, this one had a 1/8 in front, and then we square rooted -64. We can check that we did that work right. Do you see the final answer is just I, okay? All right, so that's where it comes from. So when you are simplifying radicals with negatives under them, it would just be like simplifying it with a positive with an I tacked on, okay? All right, so actually let's go down. Let's actually finish that up, okay? So let's go down to number 13. Yeah, right down here with number 13. Okay, so number 13 has a negative in front, right? But then what's underneath is 3, okay? So again, if you think about it like this, the negative becomes the I, and then we could treat this as if it were just rad 3. Now here's the thing, can we simplify rad 3? No, we cannot. Okay, so since we cannot simplify rad 3, okay, all we're gonna do is just bring down the rad 3. But what we have to do is we do have to simplify the negative part. So even if the number can't be simplified, you at least have to turn the negative into I, right? So that would be that. So again, if you look at this, this negative becomes the I, and now I'm left with rad 29. Since I can't break down rad 29, that's my answer, okay? So this one has a 3 in front. Okay, this negative, right, becomes I, then this is rad 11. Okay, then I just check, can I break down rad 11 anymore? No, I cannot. Okay, so we'll pull out our I and then we'll look at our number. So here, I'm gonna bring down the negative in the rad becomes I, the rad 10 stays rad 10. Okay, if you can't break down rad 10, you just box it up. Okay, now here's the thing. These we can't do on the calculator, and here's why. Do you see if I type in negative and then the square root of -10? Okay, it doesn't give us the answer we want. See, it gives us that, negative 3.162277666I. Okay, so it gives it to us in decimal form. We don't want it in decimal form, we want it in radical form. But do you see, look, if I type in negative, by the way, the I button is right here behind the decimal point. So we would do second decimal point and then put in rad 10, right? Which was our answer. The one thing you will notice is those decimals are totally equivalent. Okay, but we want it in simplest radical form, so we can't give it as a decimal. So the only ones you could really get away with doing completely on your calculator are the ones that have perfect squares underneath, okay? All right, so let's try another one. So again, the negative under the rad becomes I, and then this just becomes rad 20, right? So we can think about it that way. Let's deal with the I first. Now, I can't box that one up because we know from the radicals unit that 20 can be broken down. So remember, if we stick with our list of perfect squares, right? So we have 4, we have 9, we have 16, 25, 36. So same thing we were doing in the last unit. So this is not changing. Really, the only thing we're adding to this is we're just adding an I onto the problem. 64, 81, 100, right? So if you're looking at the list, do you see rad 20, right? Can be broken down into 4 and 5, which is 2 rad 5. Right? Okay, so how do you write your final answer? Because your final answer is not just 2 rad 5, it also has the I on it. Typically, the place where we put that, I know it doesn't really matter. I could make it I, 2, 5. Usually the way we do it is we put any whole number, then the I, then the rad. So we do whole number, I, rad. Okay, so here, so the first thing I'm going to think about this is there's a negative in front that I'm just going to bring over. The negative under the rad becomes I, and now I'm just looking at rad 28. Okay, So again, I simplified the imaginary part by just pulling it out as I. Now I have to think about rad 28, right? Rad 28 can be broken down because 4 goes into rad 28. So that can be broken down into 4 and 7. So now I have 2 rad 7, right? So 2 rad 7 for the rad part. We have a negative I on the outside. So how do I write my final answer? So on the outside, I have a negative, I have an I, right? So again, I could just bring that down as I'm going along, might be a better idea so we don't forget about it. Usually the way we write it though is number I rad. Okay, let's keep going with that, right? So here again, so we have a 2. Now joining the 2 is going to be the I for that negative, and then we're just going to break down 75, right? Okay, so I'm going to bring down the 2, I'm going to bring down the I. Now, let's worry about 75. 75, if we look at this list, 25 goes into 75 3 times, right? So I get 25 and 3. Okay, so this becomes 2I, rad 25 becomes 5, rad 3 stays rad 3. So final answer, again, do we see it is multiplication, so we can multiply these. So here I am going to get 10I on the outside, rad 3 on the inside, okay? Again, one thing you could always do is if you type in the original, which was 2 rad negative 75, again, not the answer we want because it's a decimal, but then we simplified it to be 10, second decimal point gets you the I, and then we had rad 3. Okay, we end up, do you see, with the same exact decimal, okay? All right, we'll do one more with you. I think I'm going to jump to this one with the fraction in front, not that it matters. So I'm going to bring down the fraction, I'm going to bring down the I, and then I'm worrying about rad 300, okay? So we're going to bring down the outside. We're going to break 300 into, so for this one, it is 100 times 3. So now I have negative 1/2 I, and then rad 100 becomes 10. So we do this little bit of multiplying over here. Again, the little bit of multiplying you could do is negative 1/2 times 10, right? So that's negative 5. So you're gonna get negative 5, don't forget your I, rad 3. Okay, so that's where your I's come from. Your I's come from if you have a radical that has a negative underneath it, we're gonna simplify it like normal. We're just gonna stick on an I. So remember, we usually put the I right after the whole number. On the problems where it only becomes a whole number because it's a perfect square, we put on the I. On the ones that break down to a number and a rad, we usually put the I in between the number and the rad, okay? Again, it doesn't matter if it's before or after, okay? You are just going to, if you're writing it for show your work, but just realize in a multiple choice, it'll always be in this order. Number, I, rad. Okay, that's it for now.